Castles may seem like an unlikely setting for a survival situation, but throughout history there have been many sieges that resulted in horrific loss of life. But how would you fare if you found yourself under siege in a medieval castle? Let's find out. What is your role during the siege? Are you a lord or lady of the castle or just a lowly peasant? What is your role during the siege? Are you a lord or lady of the castle or just a lowly peasant? Depending on your status, your responsibilities and access to resources will vary greatly. The lord or lady of the castle will need to organize the defense of the castle and make sure everything runs smoothly. Your chances of survival will depend on what you do next. Are they willing to lay siege to the castle for however long it takes? Or will they eventually give up and go away? Are they willing to lay siege to the castle for however long it takes? Or will they eventually give up and go away? The longer the attackers are willing to lay siege to the castle, the more likely it is that the defenders will eventually run out of supplies and the castle will fall. However, if the attackers are only willing to lay siege to the castle for a short period of time, then it's possible that the defenders could hold out until reinforcements arrived. Ultimately, the fate of the castle and its inhabitants would depend on the determination of the attackers and their willingness to endure the hardships of a long siege. If you're able to escape the castle and make it to safety, you'll probably live. But if you're captured, you may not make it out alive. It's also possible that the castle won't be completely destroyed, and you may be able to negotiate a surrender with the enemy. In this situation, it would be in your best interest to surrender peacefully rather than having the castle torn down around you and risking being killed in the process. This means making sure the troops are fed and ready to fight, organizing repairs to the castle walls, and generally keeping everyone's head in the game. Peasants, on the other hand, will likely be given more menial tasks such as gathering supplies or helping to dig ditches. We've all heard the old adage that an army marches on its stomach. But did you know that during the Middle Ages, castles were often equipped with kitchens that were capable of feeding thousands of people? From the basic cooking facilities in smaller fortresses to the elaborate halls in royal palaces, these medieval kitchens were essential for feeding the troops and keeping them in fighting shape. But how did they do it? Join us as we take a look at some of the most impressive medieval kitchens ever built and find out how they kept the troops fed and the castle running. Your chances of survival will depend on how well you perform your duties during the siege. If you're a leader and you make poor decisions, your castle might fall and you and the people under your charge might be killed. But if you're just a peasant, failure to perform your duties could have the same result. Question number 2. How long can you last? Supplies of food, water and other resources will dwindle as the siege drags on. Castles were often built with the expectation that they would be able to withstand months, if not years, of a siege. During the Siege of Orleans in the 100 Years' War, the English managed to lay siege to the city for almost a year before it fell. Your chances of survival will depend on how long the siege lasts. If it's only a few days, you'll probably be fine. But if it drags on for weeks or months, things will get tough. And those who don't adapt will surely die. What are the conditions like inside the castle? As the siege drags on, conditions inside the castle will likely become cramped and unsanitary. With more and more people trying to cram into the castle for safety, disease will likely start to spread. Your chances of survival will depend on how well you can adapt to these conditions. If you're able to stay clean and healthy, you'll be much more likely to survive the siege. But if you succumb to disease or injury, you may not make it out alive. How determined are the attackers? So how would you fare if you found yourself under siege in a medieval castle? Let us know your thoughts. So how would you fare if you found yourself under siege in a medieval castle? Let us know your thoughts. What do you do after surviving a medieval siege? Have you ever wondered what life was like during the Middle Ages? For most people living in those times, it probably seemed pretty normal. They woke up, they did their chores, maybe went to market, and then went home to eat dinner and go to bed. But every once in a while, something terrible would happen that would disrupt their everyday lives. And if you were around for one of these events, you'd probably be pretty traumatized by it. In today's video, we're going to find out exactly what life was like for people who had survived a medieval siege. To answer this question, we're going to look at a letter written by a knight who had survived the Siege of Orleans. This siege took place in 1428 when the English were trying to capture the city of Orleans. The siege lasted for 7 months, and during that time, the English laid siege to the city, meaning that they surrounded it and prevented anyone from coming in or out. They also bombarded the city with artillery fire, which killed many people and caused the city to burn. Despite all this, though, the French were able to hold out until the end of 1429 when the English finally lifted the siege. One of the people who survived the siege was a knight named Jean de Latz. He wrote a letter to a friend of his describing his experiences during the siege. In the letter, he describes how the English attacked the city and how the citizens were able to hold them off. He also talks about how terrible things got inside the city as the siege dragged on and on. And finally, he tells his friend how he managed to escape the city and survive the siege. The siege began in September of 1428 when the English arrived outside the city walls. They immediately began to attack the French soldiers stationed there. For the first few weeks, the English were successful and were able to breach the city walls in several places. However, the French were able to hold them off each time. By October, the English had brought in several cannons and were bombarding the city with artillery fire. This caused great damage to the city and many people lost their lives. By November, things had gotten so bad that the citizens of Orleans were starting to panic. There wasn't enough food to go around and people were beginning to starve. Despite all this, the French soldiers continued to fight bravely and they were able to hold off the English until the end of December. On January 1429, the English lifted the siege and retreated from the city. When the English left, the French citizens were overjoyed. They had survived the siege and now they could get on with their lives. Jean de Latz was one of the many French citizens who survived the siege. He managed to escape the city just before the English arrived and spent the siege living in the nearby countryside. In his letter to his friend, he describes how he had to hide in the forest and live off of berries and wild animals that he was able to catch. He also talks about how he witnessed many atrocities committed by the English soldiers and how he saw many people starve to death inside the city of Orleans. After the siege ended, Jean de Latz returned to the city of Orleans to find it in ruins. Many of his friends and family had been killed during the siege and he had lost everything that he owned. But despite all this, he was alive and that's all that mattered. He spent the next few years rebuilding his life and trying to make a living as a knight. If you had survived a medieval siege, what would you do next? Would you try to rebuild your life or would you run away and never look back? Let us know in the comments below. Now, before we go, don't forget to leave us a big thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. Subscribe for more content. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.